So good morning everyone. Today our group will be presenting on our case study on the 1MDB scandal prepared for MPU3332 Integrity and Anti-Corruption. My name is Satyanandan Salwar and I'll be presenting alongside my group members. Over the next few minutes, we'll walk you through what 1MDB was meant to be, how the fraud actually happened, who was involved, and in what it cost our country, economically, politically, and socially. We'll close with the reforms that followed and what we believe still needs to be. So, to start with the bigger picture, One Malaysia Development Berhad was founded in 2009 as a state investment fund meant to be Malaysia's economic growth. Instead, investigators alleged that billions of dollars were diverted through shell companies, fraudulent transactions, and cross-border money laundering. As you can see on the right, we are talking about approximately US dollars 4.5 billion allegedly misappropriated investigations spanning more than 6 countries, and in 2020, the conviction of a sitting former prime minister, first time that's happened in Malaysia. Our report looks at this through the lens of governance, ethics, and public accountability, and will also cover the reforms Malaysia introduced afterwards. And for the background of development fund financial scandal, you can see that 1MDB was formed after the federal government took over Terengganu Investment Authority, which had managed oil royalty revenues in Terengganu. National ambition was genuine to attract foreign direct investment, fund infrastructure, and support Malaysia's economic transformation program. But instead of funding itself through profitable operations, 1MDB grew almost entirely through debt, multi-million dollar bond issuances. By around 2013, cracks started to appear: delayed financial reports, opaque ownership structures, and overseas transactions nobody could verify. As at the box at the bottom shows, diverted funds were allegedly used to buy luxury items like real estate, artwork, super yachts, and even to help finance the Hollywood film The Wolf of Wall Street. Public development money turned into private assets. And objectives versus actual outcomes. The slide sums up tragedy of 1MDB in one table. On the left is what we on the left is what the fund was supposed to achieve. On the right is what actually happened. It was meant to promote national economic growth. Instead, we got large-scale financial losses. It was meant to attract foreign investment. Instead, declining investor confidence. It was meant to develop strategic infrastructure. Instead, causing a public debt increase. It was meant to create sustainable national wealth. Instead, it caused international corruption investigations. It was supposed to enhance our global competitiveness, but it damaged international. So, how did the scandal unfold? 1MDB was established in 2009. Between 2012 and 2013, Goldman Sachs arranged around US dollars 6.5 billion in bond offerings for the fund. That is important because Goldman later paid heavily for its role in this. By 2015, investigative outlets Sarawak Report and the Wall Street Journal alleged that hundreds of millions of dollars had entered bank accounts linked to the Prime Minister Najib Razak. In 2016, the US Department of Justice launched major asset forfeiture proceedings, calling it one of the largest kleptocracy cases that it ever pursued. Then in 2018, Malaysia had change of government, which allowed domestic investigations to finally forward. And in 2020, Najib Razak was convicted in the SRC International case, part of the wider 1MDB scandal. Key individuals involved in this were Najib Razak, a former Prime Minister and Finance Minister, chaired the 1MDB Advisory Board and was ultimately convicted in the SRC International case. First former Malaysian PM to be jailed. Jolo never had an official position in 1MDB, but is allegedly to be the mastermind who coordinated the offshore shell companies. He remains a fugitive today. Tim Lesnar and Roger Ng were both Goldman Sachs bankers. Lesnar pleaded guilty in the US to bribery and money laundering, and Ng was convicted for helping move in the funds. Riza Aziz, Najib's stepson, co-founded Red Granite Pictures, which investigators think to financing for the Wolf of Wall Street. Beyond individuals, several institutions played major roles. 1MDB itself was the central vehicle through which the funds were raised and diverted. Goldman Sachs arranged those bond offerings. And while the bonds themselves were legitimate instruments, the bank later paid billions in global settlements once misconduct by certain employees came to light. The US Department of Justice led the international effort to trace and recover stolen assets through its Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative. Domestically, the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission (MACC) became the principal agency investigating 1MDB linked offenses, especially after 2018. Moving on, we have how the fraud was carried out, and the mechanism itself, step by step, will be presented here. First, 1MDB raised billions through loans and bond issuances, publicly framed as development financing. Second, instead of investing that capital directly, it was through complex, opaque offshore shell companies. Third, funds were diverted to intermediaries using false agreements and fictitious joint ventures. The money was then layered, moved, and repeatedly across institutions and countries to obscure where it came from. Finally, the proceeds were usually used to acquire real estate, arts, private jets, yachts, jewelry, and to fund film production. This is classic money laundering structure, just executed at an enormous scale. The root cause of this scandal was five systemic root causes. Political influence meant power was concentrated enough to reduce independent oversight of major financial decisions. Weak corporate governments meant the board failed to effectively challenge or monitor management. Poor internal controls means risk management and auditing weren't strong enough to catch suspicious transactions early. Lack of this transparency through complex structures and delayed reporting blocked independent verification. And weak accountability meant that institutions meant to provide oversight simply lacked the independence to act, letting irregularities continue.
To ground this in a recognized governance framework, we assessed 1MDB against the OECD's principles of corporate governance. On accountability, decision making was concentrated among a few powerful individuals rather than being answerable to a broader board. On transparency, financial reporting was delayed and offshore transactions were nearly impossible to verify. On responsibility, risk management and financial oversight were inadequate. On fairness, public funds were allegedly diverted for private benefit at the expenses of taxpayers. And on integrity, integrity, conflicts of interest and abuse of authority undermined the entire governance structure. Every principle was compromised. Beyond governance, we also want to look at this ethically, using three classical frameworks. From a utilitarian view, did society benefit overall? No. The social and economic harm far overweighed any intended benefit. From a deontological view, were ethical duties fulfilled? No. Public officials have a duty to manage entrusted resources honestly, and that duty was violated. And from a virtue ethics perspective, were the leaders involved acting with integrity? No. Again, no. Greed and conflicts of interest compromised what should have been ethical leadership. All three lenses point to the same conclusion. Corruption at this scale doesn't just hurt people directly involved; it ripples outward. The government absorbed direct financial liabilities and reputational damage. Ordinary citizens and taxpayers were left with higher public debt and reduced government spending capacity. Foreign investors grew more cautious, perceiving greater governance risk in Malaysia. Financial institutions face regulatory investigations and legal penalties. Government and employees came under increased scrutiny and pressure to reform, and the international community responded with greater cross-border cooperation on anti-money laundering enforcement. This is really a case study in how corruption spreads its cost across an entire society. Let's talk numbers. National debt rose because the government had guaranteed many 1MDB's borrowings. So when the fund faltered, taxpayers effectively inherited the bill. Investigator confidence declined as international investors grew cautious about government's risk in Malaysia. The ringgit also experienced volatility, which raised import costs and added inflationary pressure. But perhaps the most important point is the opportunity cost. What could that 4.5 billion US dollars actually have funded? Hospitals and healthcare, public universities and research, affordable housing, transport infrastructure, renewable energy, and student scholarship. This wasn't just money. This wasn't just money lost. It was a whole generation of development opportunities lost. The consequences went well beyond economics. Politically, the 2018 general election marked the first ever defeat of the long-ruling Barisan National Coalition, and one MDB was widely seen as one of the defining issues in that election. Socially, public trust in institutions declined as citizens began questioning whether agencies could act independently of political power. And internationally, the scandal triggered a cooperation between the US, Singapore, Switzerland, Luxembourg, and the UK, all working together to trace funds, freeze assets, and prosecute the individuals involved. This really was a case that redrew Malaysia's political landscape and reshaped how countries cooperate on financial crime. How did Malaysia respond? Several major reforms followed. The Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission was strengthened with expanded investigate powers and greater independence after the 2018 change of government. Section 17A of the MACC Act, which came into force in June 2020, introduced corporate liability, meaning a company can now be held responsible if someone associated with it engages in corruption, unless the company can show it had adequate preventive procedures. The National Anti-Corruption Plan, covering 2019 to 2023, aimed to improve governance. The National Anti-Corruption Plan, covering 2019 to 2023, aimed to improve governance, transparency, and procurement more broadly. And whistleblower protection was strengthened to encourage people to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Recommendations. Building on those reforms, our group put forward 6 recommendations. First, strengthen board independence by appointing qualified and empowered directors. Second, improve financial transparency through mandatory independent audits. Third, strengthen internal controls with continuous risk monitoring. Fourth, enhance legal protection for whistleblowers. Fifth, promote integrity and ethics education in universities and government agencies, which is actually part of why we're presenting this today. And 6, increase international cooperation on asset recovery. And sixth, increase international cooperation on asset recovery, since financial crime increasingly crosses borders. To bring this all together, the one MDB scandal shows us that it wasn't just individual wrongdoing that allowed this to happen. It was systemic weakness in governance, transparency, and accountability. Malaysia's legal reforms represent real progress, but lasting integrity cannot come from legislation alone. It depends just as much on ethical leadership, independent oversight, and an informed, engaged public holding institutions accountable. Thank you. We're happy to take any questions. These are the sources. These are the sources that we use throughout our research, including reports from the U.S. Department of Justice, Encyclopedia Britannica, the OECD and Investigate Journalism from Sarawak Report and the Wall Street Journal. Thank you again for listening.